A loaf in the freezer aisle carries a biblical name, a numbered verse, and the aura of ancient authority. Turn the package over, and the modern promise becomes even stronger. Sprouted grains, complete protein, and no ordinary flour. It sounds as though the prophet Ezekiel designed a perfect wellness bread thousands of years before nutrition science. But open the Bible, read the whole passage, and that reassuring story collapses almost immediately. Ezekiel's bread was not introduced as a superfood, a longevity recipe, or a model breakfast. It belonged to a disturbing public sign about siege, scarcity, rationing, impurity, and the coming suffering of Jerusalem. Hello friends, and welcome back to Biblical Wellness HQ. Today we will separate three things people often blend together: the biblical text, the modern branded loaf, and the nutrition evidence. By the end you will know what the verse actually means, what sprouting can change, and how to judge the bread without borrowing holiness from a label. The famous ingredient list appears in Ezekiel chapter 4, verse 9. Wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and spelt. Read alone. That line resembles a deliberate recipe assembled from grains and legumes. Yet the next instructions are not about abundance. Ezekiel must measure his food and water under severe restriction. The bread is eaten during a symbolic performance representing what siege would do to the people inside Jerusalem. A fixed ration is not presented as ideal portion control. It is a warning that ordinary access to food will disappear. The surrounding verses describe anxiety, astonishment, and people wasting away because bread and water have become scarce. Context changes the emotional meaning of every ingredient in the bowl. This is survival food assembled from what remains, not a menu endorsed as nutritionally perfect for all generations. In a well-stocked household, wheat could be used on its own for bread. During shortage, however, small reserves of different grains and pulses might be combined because no single supply was sufficient. Barley was generally less prestigious than fine wheat, while lentils and beans were familiar staples with practical value. Millet and spelt added more available grain, but the passage never explains them through vitamins, amino acids, or disease prevention. The mixture communicates depletion. Containers are being emptied, and unlike ingredients are pressed together. That does not make the bread nutritionally worthless. It makes its original purpose very different from modern advertising. A responsible reading begins by asking what the sign meant to Ezekiel's first audience. Only after that should we ask whether a modern loaf, inspired by the list, can fit a healthy diet. The scene begins far from Jerusalem, among Judean exiles living under Babylonian power beside the Kebar River. Ezekiel speaks as both priest and prophet to people who have already lost land, security, and familiar institutions. Jerusalem still stands. So many listeners can imagine that the disaster is temporary and normal life will soon return. The early chapters challenge that hope with strange public actions designed to make an invisible warning impossible to ignore. Ezekiel builds a miniature Jerusalem, stages a siege against it, and embodies the pressure closing around the city. The bread belongs inside that sequence. Removing it is like removing one object from a courtroom and calling it a recipe. Its meaning comes from the brick, the siege works, the measured days, the restricted movement, and the shrinking rations. Before nutrition enters the story, the audience is being asked to feel what national collapse could look like at household scale. Biblical prophets sometimes communicated through enacted signs as well as speeches, turning ordinary objects into public warnings. In Ezekiel chapter 4, pasture, fuel, water, grain, and time operate together as parts of one sustained performance. The prophet is told to lie on his sides for appointed periods, while bearing the symbolic weight of communal guilt. Whether every detail was enacted literally or presented as prophetic drama, the literary purpose remains unmistakably severe. Nothing in the chapter invites the audience to isolate the loaf and reproduce it for strength, weight loss, or longevity. The sign works because bread, the symbol of daily provision, has been reduced to something anxious, counted, and compromised. That reversal is the first clue that the popular story says more about modern marketing than the ancient passage. The text gives a daily bread ration of 20 shekels by weight, and a measured fraction of a hin of water. This is not modern calorie tracking chosen for personal optimization. It is the loss of ordinary access under siege. The ration is eaten at appointed times, reinforcing that the person cannot simply return to the jar when hunger rises. Measured water is especially ominous because dehydration, cooking, sanitation, and survival all compete for the same scarce supply. The following explanation removes any ambiguity. Jerusalem will lack bread and water, and people will look at one another in dismay. The numbers create pressure, not a promise that this amount or ingredient ratio should guide a healthy person today. A siege does not merely reduce calories. It dismantles the entire system that brings food from field to household. Farmers cannot safely reach crops, trade routes close, fuel becomes scarce, storage jars empty, and clean water grows harder to obtain. Families first consume preferred staples, then substitute less familiar ingredients, then combine whatever fragments remain. That progression explains the mixed grain image more naturally than the idea of a prophet engineering an ideal amino acid profile. Wheat, barley, pulses, millet, and spelt represent different reserves converging because separation has become a luxury. The loaf therefore visualizes a pantry near exhaustion. Several containers contribute, yet none holds enough on its own. This interpretation does not require declaring any ingredient inferior. The warning lies in forced mixture and restricted quantity. The same foods can nourish in a generous meal and signify disaster when gathered as the last remnants of supply. Bread was not a decorative side dish in the ancient Levant. It was a central form of daily sustenance. Households ground grain, mixed dough, managed fermentation when possible, and baked on hot surfaces or in simple ovens. That work required water, fuel, time, tools, stored grain, and a measure of social stability. Siege threatens every link in that chain, which is why damaged bread carries such emotional force in prophetic language. Fine wheat bread could signal greater means, while barley commonly served broader and humbler patterns of eating. Legumes added valuable nourishment across the region, but their presence here is governed by the narrative of depletion. The passage never supplies a formula, baking temperature, sprouting interval, loaf size, or nutritional claim for later readers. Calling it an ancient recipe therefore gives the text a culinary precision that the text itself never provides. The fuel command is shocking because the sign is meant to communicate defilement, not rustic culinary authenticity. Human waste is never necessary to show on screen. The moral and ritual shock can be explained without graphic imagery. Ezekiel objects by appealing to a lifetime of avoiding foods regarded as unclean or improperly handled. The concession to cattle dung preserves the atmosphere of scarcity while answering the prophet's protest. Dried animal dung has served as fuel in wood-poor settings, but that practical fact does not turn the scene into a lifestyle recommendation. Within the chapter, contaminated preparation anticipates food eaten under foreign domination, far from the protections of home. A package that quotes only the ingredient sentence removes the very verses that explain why this bread matters. The omission may be commercially convenient, but context restores the difference between sacred scripture and sacred-sounding sales language. Ezekiel's audience lived during the long crisis that culminated in Babylon's destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. The book is not reporting that catastrophe from a calm distance. It speaks into fear, denial, displacement, and judgment. For exiles, the miniature siege and rationed bread made events in Jerusalem present before reliable news could arrive. The sign said that the city's confidence, walls, stores, and rituals would not protect it from the consequences being announced. Later history gives the chapter gravity, but the bread remains a symbol inside that prophetic message rather than a diet plan. Reading historically does not drain the passage of spiritual meaning. It prevents modern desires from replacing its actual warning. The question shifts from, what miracle ingredient did God hide here? To why was ordinary bread made frightening? That better question prepares us to evaluate the modern loaf honestly, without mocking faith or granting advertising divine authority. Modern consumers meet Ezekiel chapter 4 in a world where ancient language signals purity, simplicity, and lost wisdom. A numbered verse on packaging can feel more trustworthy than an unfamiliar technical claim, even before we inspect the nutrition panel. The ingredient list also fits contemporary expectations: whole grains, legumes, sprouting, plant protein, and minimal processing. Those features allow a compelling story to form around a product that may already have genuine nutritional strengths. But a true ingredient list can still be wrapped in a misleading historical interpretation. The marketing move is subtle. It rarely needs to say that God prescribed the loaf if design and naming invite that conclusion. Consumers then transfer authority from Scripture to the product and from the product to health, claims the passage never makes. Discernment means separating those layers without assuming that every biblical reference is exploitation or every modern loaf is unhealthy. The phrase Ezekiel bread is not a nutritional standard enforced across every bakery, country, or homemade recipe. One loaf may use several sprouted grains and legumes. Another may change proportions, add gluten, sweeteners, oil, or preservatives. Slice weight can differ enough to distort casual comparisons of calories, protein, fiber, sodium, and carbohydrate. A darker color does not prove whole grain content, and a seed-covered crust does not reveal what dominates the dough. Likewise, refrigeration or freezer storage may reflect moisture and preservative choices, not automatic nutritional superiority. No biblical name can tell you whether the texture suits your teeth, the fiber suits your digestion, or the price suits your budget. Those are ordinary questions, but ordinary questions protect people better than a dramatic label. The modern product earns its place at the table through measurable qualities, not through resemblance to an ancient warning. The most uncomfortable part of the account concerns how the bread was to be baked. Ezekiel is initially commanded to prepare it over human excrement in the sight of the people. The point is not a cooking technique. It symbolizes the defiled food Israel would eat among the nations. Ezekiel protests that he has avoided ritual defilement throughout his life. The command is then modified, allowing cattle dung as the cooking fuel instead. Dung fuel itself was historically practical when wood was scarce, but the prophetic sign deliberately made impurity visible. A glossy package may print the ingredient verse while leaving this surrounding meaning outside the frame. That omission transforms a warning about humiliation into a comforting story about ancient nutritional wisdom. Modern Ezekiel-style bread is not the ration described in the prophetic performance. It is usually a commercially produced loaf made from sprouted grains and legumes with controlled sanitation, modern milling, yeast, and refrigeration. Different manufacturers use different proportions and processes, so the biblical name does not define one standardized recipe. The product can be nutritious, but its nutritional properties come from ingredients and processing, not from the sacred sound of its name. A verse on the wrapper is a marketing frame, not laboratory evidence. This distinction does not require cynicism toward faith or toward the company making the bread. It simply prevents theology, history, and nutrition from being collapsed into one sales claim. We can respect Scripture more deeply by refusing to make it promise something the passage never promised. Sprouting begins when a seed absorbs water and starts the early stages of germination. Enzymes become active, stored compounds begin to change, and the grain prepares to support a growing plant. Depending on the seed and process, sprouting may reduce some phytate and alter the availability of certain nutrients. It may also change flavor, texture, digestibility, and the way the dough behaves. But the word sprouted does not automatically mean low carbohydrate, gluten-free, or appropriate for every medical condition. Wheat, barley, and spelt still contain gluten, So this bread is not safe for people with celiac disease. Some people with sensitive digestion may also react to the dense fiber or fermentable carbohydrates. Sprouting is a real food process with modest potential benefits, not a biblical mechanism that turns bread into medicine. Germination changes a seed over time, but the result depends on grain variety, moisture, temperature, duration, and processing afterward. A short controlled sprout is not nutritionally identical to a long germination, and neither remains unchanged after drying and baking. Research can show shifts in phytate, enzymes, vitamins, starches, or phenolic compounds without proving a dramatic clinical benefit from every loaf. Some reported improvements occur in laboratory composition, while evidence for long-term health outcomes from specific commercial breads remains limited. That distinction matters because nutrient availability, blood glucose, digestion, and disease risk are different scientific questions. A responsible claim uses words such as may, can, or depending on the process, when the effect is variable. It also compares the actual bread with a relevant alternative, not with the weakest refined product chosen to guarantee victory. Sprouting can be worthwhile, but the label should begin an investigation rather than end one. Combining grains and legumes can improve the balance of essential amino acids compared with relying on one grain alone. That principle helps explain why grain and legume meals have supported populations across many cultures. A modern loaf containing wheat and lentils may therefore provide a useful mixture of plant proteins. Still, one slice does not become equivalent to a large serving of fish, eggs, dairy, or legumes. Protein claims should be checked on the nutrition label by grams per serving, not inferred from the front of the package. The same is true for fiber, sodium, added sweeteners, and serving size. For adults after 50, total daily protein and its distribution across meals matter more than a mystical reputation attached to one loaf. Bread can contribute to the pattern, but it should not carry the entire nutritional burden of the meal. Because sprouted grain bread often contains intact components and fiber, some versions may produce a gentler glucose response than refined white bread. Yet blood sugar response varies with the recipe, slice size, individual metabolism, and everything eaten alongside it. Two thick slices with honey and dried fruit are a different meal from one slice with eggs, vegetables, or unsweetened yogurt. People using insulin or glucose-lowering medication still need to count the carbohydrate according to their care plan. The phrase "no flour" when used does not mean no carbohydrate. Grinding sprouted grains into dough changes their physical form, even if conventional refined flour was never added. The useful question is not whether the loaf is biblical, but how much carbohydrate, fiber, and sodium your actual serving provides. Personal glucose readings and professional guidance are more informative than a halo created by ancient language. Start with the ingredient list and confirm that whole or sprouted grains and legumes appear prominently. Then check the serving size, because unusually thin slices can make every number look more impressive. Compare fiber and protein per slice, but also inspect sodium, which can vary significantly between breads. Look for added sugars without assuming that every sweetener makes a loaf harmful. Choose a product you can digest, afford, store safely, and eat in a realistic portion. Frozen storage is common because many sprouted loaves use fewer preservatives, but storage method is not proof of superior nutrition. If you have celiac disease, a wheat allergy, kidney disease, diabetes, or a prescribed low-fiber plan, obtain individualized advice. No front label phrase can replace the back label, your medical context, and the rest of your diet. Instead of treating the bread as the meal, use one slice as a foundation for a balanced plate. Add a meaningful protein source, such as eggs, fish, plain yogurt, cottage cheese, tofu, or a legume spread that suits you. Include vegetables or fruit for volume, color, and additional fiber. Use olive oil, nuts, seeds, or avocado in portions that match your energy needs. If chewing is difficult, toast carefully or choose a softer whole grain option rather than forcing a dense loaf. If appetite is low, prioritize protein and total nourishment instead of choosing bread only because its label sounds virtuous. The best bread is not the one with the most dramatic story. It is the one that supports your overall pattern. That pattern includes enough food, enough protein, vegetables, movement, sleep, and treatment prescribed by your clinician. So is Ezekiel bread a biblical superfood or modern marketing? The honest answer is that the modern loaf may be a solid whole grain choice, while the superfood story is largely a marketing interpretation. The biblical passage documents a prophetic sign of deprivation and defilement, not a divine nutrition prescription. Sprouting and grain-legume combinations have legitimate food science interest, but neither makes the product miraculous. Some people will enjoy the texture and nutrition, others need a different bread because of gluten, digestion, cost, or personal preference. You do not dishonor Scripture by reading the context, and you do not dishonor nutrition by checking the label. In fact, both practices ask for the same virtue, discernment. If this changed the way you see the famous verse, tell us in the comments what surprised you most. Subscribe to Biblical Wellness HQ for ancient wisdom, modern science, and practical guidance without miracle claims. And remember, a wise food choice does not need borrowed holiness to earn a place at your table.